Thanks everybody for joining. Today's topic is going to be workflow around Domino Vault, and I'll be switching back and forth. A big thanks to James Kneep, who put this together, and I'm presenting as in his stead. So I will do my best to do it credit. So workflow within Vault, this is one of the big differentiators for us, especially when you look at other products and components and capabilities, is the ability to manage content, assign tasks, and work through processes. So I'm going to kind of go through at a very high level some of the concepts around how Vault handles workflow, what are the components of it, how it works, things like that. We'll go through stages, the buttons, activities that can happen, and we'll kind of develop a conditional workflow to show you how you can mix rules along with workflow, and obviously access control, which is a big component of this around that. So at a very high level, workflow within Vault is done within the stages section, obviously, if you've been in there so far. And, a stage is best defined as kind of a state in which the Vault application is at a certain point in time. The easiest way that I convey this to customers and other people is think of when you draw out a workflow diagram, each of the boxes is kind of a stage, and then the flow between those are the arrows or the lines between stages that say, based on this action, it goes to this different stage in the workflow. So it's very easy to kind of build up a process flow within Vault to have different stages, and then to have different actions within those stages, and then also who has access to those, not only the form elements and items within the application, but also to that stage itself. So who can act at different stages along the way. The other piece of a stage and the workflow within Vault is each application within the Vault application can kind of have a different action that happens upon submission. So, and you'll see this when you go into the edit form properties of the page, is that you can say, just show the success message, and I'll show you this in just a moment. You can also display a new form, or you can go to the next stage. So think of these as, obviously, so showing the success message is, common if it's a simple thing like contact me, where once it's been submitted, the message says, hey, thank you for your submission, we'll get back to you, whatever that may be. The second one here, where you want to display a new form, think of it more of as a data entry scenario, where I'm entering some information in, and when I submit it, I get a new form, and I can enter information in, and I submit it, and I get a new form. So it's basically, refreshing and giving you a new entry point. And the last one here is when you submit, it actually moves it to the next stage. So depending on access and flow, if I submit something, then maybe it goes to an approval review, or it goes to an acceptance, or whatever that next stage is. It can automatically traverse you there. So those are configured within the application level. Kind of continuing on some of these concepts, the different stages, as I mentioned before, are going to define not only the flow. So let's say you have 3 stages, like you see here. You have an approval request, awaiting approval, and approved are basically the 3 stages. You define not only just the form behavior as what is visible, what's hidden, what pages are visible, what attributes or elements of the form are visible, or which ones are hidden, or which ones are read-only, those types of scenarios. But also it defines the flow. So when you do hit submit, or you do hit update, or you do hit approve, or whatever that button is, moves you to the next piece. So it's controlling the flow of things. And then obviously the access rights. So based on either roles or specific people, they have different access to different stages. And what we mean by that is the ability to act on those, to even see them, to participate in those workflow. So when you define all your stages, you're defining not only what state they're in, but also what behavior happens, what the next action is, and then obviously who has access to all of this. So if we start with the very basic, and the example that I'll be using will follow kind of this workflow is everything has a start, but in the sample workflow that you'll see and the one that you'll get after this is upon saving, think of it as save draft, or I start to input something and I want to save it and I'll come back to it later. And that's going to kind of create a loop of creating. So my options is I could save it, which is going to move it to the next stage, which is in progress. Or if I've completed it, then I can send it, I can say it's ready for approval, and which will then send it on for approval, which is the next stage. So again, think of each of these boxes as a stage in the workflow. And then from there, obviously, I can continue in the in progress and save and kind of loop through that. Once it's in the approval stage, I could reject it, which would send it back to the in progress, or I could actually approve it, which in this case, very simply just kind of moves it to the end. So each of these boxes will be a stage that we'll build out, and then each of these actions from each of these stages is kind of the arrows and the flow of this. So when you see, you kind of get an idea of this. Obviously, to access, it's under the Stages tab. It's very similar to the form view in the sense that you'll see your form in the middle of the page, you'll see your stages to the left, and you'll see your pages to the right. There's some just nuances around it. Every application, when you create it, includes 3 stages out of the box. You'll get a start, which is where everybody obviously starts. You'll get a submitted, and then an end. And so the start stage is basically what happens when it's brand new. So you've got an empty application or an empty form or tool, whatever you're building in this. And that the one thing that's special about this is you can never transition back to start. And I'll show you what that means in just a moment. And that's why we have this submitted stage, in the sense that once you save or you submit from the start, it's going to move it into that submitted where it kind of sits in the middle. The last stage, end, is basically when things are done. A lot of times when you develop applications, you may never move something into end, just because the end stage, once it hits that, you can't transition out of that stage. It's basically done. So this is common on basic submission, contact us or a register or something like that, where it's simply just collecting the information, you move it to end, and you're not going to do anything with that data. It's locked down, it's moved. Whereas the submit allows you to kind of iterate over it or to move between these stages and that. So if we were to take a look at this example here, so I've got a fairly simple workflow piece here, and this is kind of the idea of an expense form. Common scenario where you put in your employee name, you're going to select what your expense is, add those in there, and you're going to submit it for approval. So right now it's just a basic submit, and you can see here these manager comments and things like that are part of the form. But if we were to take a look at what this is, and this is the basic, this isn't the workflow that I showed you in the previous slide, but you'll see underneath the stages form, obviously you have a very similar view that you see on the forms view, as far as your application in the middle, your pages off to the side, and on the left-hand side, you see your different stages. And as I mentioned, each one of these starts with just these 3 stages. And you can see we're in the start phase. If I were to hit the submit button, it's going to move it to the submitted stage. So my only choices right now are to either move to submitted or end. And in the submitted stage here, you can see if I hit update, which is the button on this page, it's actually just going to iterate back to submitted, or I could send it to the end. So very simply, being able to set up a stage, the direction in which it's going, and the end state based on these buttons. Now, if you look back at the previous sessions that we've done, you could have custom buttons. You could hide these, and I think Marty's session talked about how you could have custom buttons on the page that can then call these. But in this session, we'll just focus on using the native buttons that are on the pages here. So this one just has a start, has a submitted and has an end right now. And you can see here, once it hits the end stage, it doesn't move from anywhere else. You can't transition out of it. And as I mentioned before, from the start, you can't go back to start. So even if I'm in this submitted, you'll see my options don't include start. So you'll have to create an interim state that I'll show you here in just a moment around that. But basically, it's the layout. So here's your form. You'll see different icons, different properties based on this than you see on the main form, as well as your applications over here on the other side. So let's start about building out this workflow here for expense approvals. So adding a new stage. So as I talked about, you just have start, submitted, and end as native, but I want to add another one. And it's just a simple matter of clicking add a new stage, and think of it again as just a box in your workflow. So I'm going to create one that's maybe in progress. I'll create one that's approved, maybe rejected. Different types of flows based on what you need. But it's just a simple matter of clicking the plus sign there. You give it a new name, and then we can start to configure the properties of that. So when you select the stage, as you noticed on the previous view when I was showing you the application itself, you're going to see the action buttons that are associated with it. So from the start, you saw submit. In the submitted, you saw update. And those can be changed. So, but every one of them, when you create a new stage, it's going to have a submit and a cancel. Very basically, submit, no matter what you call it, is going to move it to the next stage based on what you define it. And the cancel is basically, if you think of it as a reset, it's going to reset your form, clear the fields in there. And you don't have to have that on the page. Every stage needs to have at least a submit, but you don't have to have a cancel on the page. And then you can obviously have multiple submits and actions on that. And that's what you do here. So if I wanted to add buttons, so maybe it was an update, maybe it was a save as draft, maybe it was send for approval, whatever those buttons are that you want to have on the page, they are behind the scenes called submit buttons, which is just transitioning from one stage to the next. But you can call them what you want. So you can add them here, you can change the names of them, and you can add additional pieces around there. So, but you always start out with a submit and cancel, and then you can go through and update those values in there. As I mentioned here, you get the submit, obviously, and you also get the cancel, which basically clears out the form on this. So every submit is going to define, once you click that button, where does it go next? Does it iterate back to itself? Does it go to another stage? What are the options? And you can have multiple buttons on the page. And as you'll see later, you can actually then place rules on those buttons to display based on content that's in your form, just like you can on the form itself to show and hide. You can show and hide buttons on those pages. And you'll talk here, you can have an approve button that puts it into the approve stage, as well as a reject that maybe puts it back into a different status based on that flow. So what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and we'll add these stages in here. So we're going to first go ahead and create some new stages, and then we'll define what happens in each of those stages. So you can see before we have a start, a submit, and an end. When we finish this up, we're going to have a start, which allows the person to save their progress. We also, and then also obviously submit for approval. So if you think of the travel expense, doing that in there. And even though they're, show in some sort of order on the page here, you can traverse in between. Obviously, you can't go back to the start, but you can move up and down in between stages, however you want. So let's go ahead and create a couple of these. So I'm actually going to change the submitted one, and I'm going to just call it, in progress. And this properties is very similar to your forms page and things that you can set here. It's got the name, and they all start out with ST. So I'll give it something favorable here. And instead of update, here's where you would add additional buttons, but I'm going to actually just call this save. Let's say I'm going to have a cancel, and then I'm going to add another button in here and make this for approval. Basically what I'm doing here is just creating another submit button like we talked about, which is going to take another action that's going to send it to another phase. And like I said, I could remove that cancel, or maybe if I just want to have it called reset, you know, what you like within that stage. And I'll get into even more details around that. And then the last one here, I'll create an approval stage. I'll call it approval review. So again, going back to that diagram, if you think of the process flow here, as a user starts out in start, and if they hit submit, and I'll just say, you know, save, let's say, is going to send it to the in progress. And then I will put in here another button in here that just says, you know, something like that. And the reason for that middle stage here is that I want to be able to iterate around this. And like I said, you can't move back to the start phase. So when I open up my application and I input information, if I hit the save button, it's going to move me to the in progress. And every time I hit save, I'm going to stay in this phase. So I'm just kind of looping through. Remember the diagram that showed, you know, just kind of a save as a draft, and you keep saving your information. But as soon as I'm ready, then I can configure it to move. So basically what I've said here is from the start, if I get partway through and I don't want to send all of my information, I can just save it, and it's going to move it into the in progress, which allows me to save that information. And you could do that. You can edit these things either here or even down at the bottom where you see the buttons themselves. So for instance, if I wanted to change the name of that, just say, you know, update. Whatever I want to have these buttons called, I can have them act upon that. So when I'm in the start, I can save it or I can send it for approval, and you can see where it's going to send it. Once I've in this in progress stage, then I can go ahead and I can continue to update it, or I can go ahead and send it for approval. And then upon approval, I may have different buttons in here. So let's say I'm going to have an approve, and then maybe I create another one that's actually going to be, you know, reject. And this reject is going to send it back to an earlier stage. Okay, so if you think about that, it's going to send it back to this stage here where it opens up and they can start to edit these things. So basically I have my flow that you saw in the earlier diagram. So when I come into the form, I can save it and I kind of work around in that in progress, or I can send it on for approval. Once it's in approval stage, the manager could come in and approve it, which would send it to end, or it may have another stage that you want to put it into, or I could reject it, which then sends it back. So you can see the stages that are created and the actions out of each of those stages. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the rest of the form and screen here. So as I mentioned before, it's very similar to the Forms UI, but in the middle, instead of being able to edit the properties of the field, you can set things to be editable or visible, and they're indicated by those little icons. So there's a lock and an eyeball. And what this means is within a stage, you can set either an entire page, or you can set a form item, such as a single line edit or a checkbox or drop down or field, to be editable or locked down, read only, or visible or not visible. And if you think of scenarios where you would use something like this, would be if in the initial phase in that form where you saw the manager comments at the bottom, well, when I'm submitting my form, it doesn't make sense for me to see manager comments. So I can actually hide it in the start phase. And then in the approval phase, I can make that visible and editable. And then when it gets rejected and sent back, I can make it visible and locked down. And so you have control over the individual elements as to whether or not you want to show or hide, which is indicated again by this I or the slash to the I, and whether or not it's editable, which means it's unlocked or locked. And that can be at a page level as well, or at an individual line item. So for example, in a page, if you think of a workflow where one person goes in and completes some information and they hit submit, and somebody else has to input information onto that second form, that second form isn't visible to the first user. And so when the approver comes in, they see all the information, but it's read only. And then the approver comes in, sees it, and then they actually see the second page, which is editable, and you can hide a page. I do this, I took a hint from Christopher and James, is I actually have a config page that I put all my hidden elements on, and I make that page invisible. And what that means is that people can't navigate to that page, no matter what the stage is, because I set it to invisible in all the stages. So your navigational buttons, for example, won't show the ability to go next or back if there's not a page there. So you can basically set the visibility to this. So if we take a look at this form, again, in the middle, you can see, when I'm in the start phase, all of these things are editable because as an end user, I need to come in and fill these out. But I don't want manager comments to be seen. So I'm actually just going to click not visible. Now, in the approval review, I'm going to lock all of these fields down because the manager shouldn't be able to edit these fields. They should just be able to see these, and they're all read only at that point around that. But this field here is editable. And then maybe in this stage, when it gets returned, I want to make this visible, but I want to make it locked down. But I want these to be actually open. So you can see here, these are editable. So very easily you can configure things to be seen, to be hidden. If you had multiple pages, you could even, hide the entire page. You could lock down the entire page, or you can lock down individual elements. And it depends upon which stage you're in. So like I said, when I'm in the start phase here, all of this is editable. This is not seen. When I'm in the progress, this is locked down, but these are all editable. When I'm in the approval, these are all locked down, but this is visible and editable. So you can easily control what gets shown, what gets to be able to be edited just by simply clicking these components on here. So it's kind of thinking of them as disabled in the typical standpoint. If I dive in a little bit here onto the action buttons. So as I mentioned before, when you create a stage, it creates a set of buttons, a submit and a cancel. And of course you can add additional ones. Each one of those buttons then has some properties. So I showed you before how you can change the title, meaning if I want it to say submit, save, update, send for approval, whatever I want those buttons to say. It actually has activities. So what happens when you click on that button? There's the completion message. So when I do hit submit, for example, what's it going to tell the end user? Thank you for submission. Does it redirect them someplace else? As you can see here in the redirect URL. And as we talked about before, does it open up a new form, or does it just take them to the next stage, or does it just show them a message around that? So all of these properties are very similar to the other properties that you've seen in different fields. You can assign CSS classes, any sort of hover text, and you can also set rules on all of those too. The other thing is with each of these buttons, aside from moving it from one stage to the next or back, there's also things that can happen when they hit submit. And the two things that can happen is you can either send an email or you can call a service. And sending an email is pretty common. So if you think in terms of this example here with a travel request, where I input my travel information, my expense information, and I hit submit, it would then send an email to my manager or whomever's next in the line, and that person would then get a notification, and you could put some information in that email about the form, some data, please take an action, a link back to the form, things like that, just to notify them that something's happened. The other thing that can happen is you can call a service, and these can actually be combined, meaning that you could call a service and send an email. You can call multiple services and send an email, or send multiple emails. It's not just a binary choice in there. But calling a service is just like you saw before, and I think in the later session we'll talk about services. But think of it, if I want to populate a backend system. So for instance, in this travel expense system, maybe I want to put the data from this form into an actual travel tool, or maybe an ERP system, or a CRM system, or whatever it may be. I could call a service that would then take the data from the application and post it into another application, or maybe go off to another application and get some information based on what I submitted and do that. So each time that you have a submit action, save or submit action, you can either send an email, or you can call a service, or you can do both. But that service is basically going to take some sort of action on your behalf. Examples of that we use today is that when we register a business partner, once it's been approved, we call a service upon submission, and it creates a record in CRM. So it creates an account, and it creates a contact record in CRM. It then takes a document and pushes it into another database, sends a notification, and then when finance looks at it and they do their approval, then it does another update. So that's kind of the example of what a service can do versus just an email notification. So I talked about here the email piece, very simple to do. You can obviously insert items from the actual application and form itself into the email body, as well as the to and the subject and stuff. So think of it as you would build out an email that says, Ken has submitted a travel expense for, New York, whatever those fields may be, and I can build out the subject line, and then I can build out the body and do those types of things. Volt has the ability to recognize that if you have an email somewhere in your form, that those are eligible items to put into the to or the BCC, or you can just hard code. If it's going to a specific mailbox, you can actually just put in the email address that you want this thing submitted to. And then you have obviously the email body around this. As we talked about just here, so you have this picker that says I want to insert a link to this form. I want to insert a field item from this form, and that could either go into the content of the email, or it could go into the subject. And think of it like a Word document where you have fields that are going to get populated by a merge, and you're going to say, submitter has submitted a travel expense for, you can put in the dollar amount and location or something like that, and say, please approve, and we can put a link to the form in the email itself. So we kind of take a look at what that means here. So in the start, obviously we have, once I want to send it on for approval, for example, I want to go and create an email. And all I did there was I opened up the properties, and I can do it from here, or I can do it from down here at the bottom. It's all the same. So the buttons and the configuration. And this is where you would actually do it. So do I want to send an email or call a service? And in this case, I'm going to send an email. And you can see here that I'm going to send it to, an email, or as I mentioned before, if I just wanted to type in, I can put in a piece in there. And then in the subject, I'm going to say, I'm going to grab their name, employee name. And again, in the body, it's the same thing. So if I want to put in manager's comments, just in that value, or if I want to put in individual items, so employee name has submitted, and whatever other fields that I want to put into this field, so the expense total, whatever. So what happens here is that they would get an email that says, Ken has submitted an expense report. Here's the name, the expense total, and I'll put in something like a link to the form. So then it builds out a link that the approver would then come in and click on it. It would take them into this next phase of the approval. So very easy to do around that. Now let's say from rejection, you could do the same thing. You could send an email back to the person that submitted that form here, or let's say during the approval, I actually want to call a service. And so, I could update another LEAP application here, or I could post it off to, another CRM, ERP system here using the services piece. So it's very easy to create an action that happens based on this approval here. So when we go through this process, if you take a look at this, you'll notice now that I'm in a stage, I don't see any manager approvals in here. And one note here I didn't talk about, when you go into the preview mode, you never have your submit buttons available. You have to actually deploy your application. So when you're testing your application, you'll make your changes, deploy it, and then you'll have actions to submit to test out what happened in those different phases. But you'll see here, since I'm in this start phase, the manager comments aren't visible, but all of these fields are available to the end user. So you can kind of test out what gets shown and what doesn't get shown within each of the different phases and flows around that. Okay. So kind of moving on. So as I mentioned here, calling a service. So obviously this could be another Volt application. It could also be a REST call the same way, and it works just like the other service calls do in the rest of the application here, but it happens when the submit action is taken on that button. So what if we want to have kind of a conditional workflow? And I talked about before how you can have buttons that show and hide, just like you can have form elements show and hide using rules. And so a scenario around this would be, if a expense amount is over a certain amount, maybe it needs an additional step or it needs a secondary approval within that. I'd want to create a different stage based on that, or maybe based on some sort of data field in the application, it goes into a different approval queue or a different route, or it skips over a step or whatever does that. So you can actually take multiple submit buttons, you can apply different rules to those, and then have them take different actions based on what's visible to the end user. So in this case here, what we'll do is we'll say, if the entire request is greater than $2,000, then I want to put a special approval button in there, and I want to assign somebody to that. So if you look at this modified workflow, basically from the start, there's a decision that says, is it greater than $2,000? If it's not, then it just goes to the normal approval. Otherwise, it's going to have a special approval that's going to go to somebody else, or it's going to require additional information around that. And that's done very simply, just like you do on anything else. You create these rules, and these rules would then apply to that button. So just like you apply rules to form elements, you apply the rules to the submit buttons around that. So let's take a look in here. I'm going to create a new action in here. I'll just call it special approval. And in this stage here, in progress, maybe I'm going to create a new item. And again, just different ways to get at it. I could go into the properties here and add a button, or just down here at the bottom, you can actually hide that. There's an add, and it does the same thing. So just a quick way to add a button. You can see it added it up here at the top. And I'm going to call this, special approval. And that's going to go, when they click on that, it's going to go to the special approval queue. And right now it just goes to end. I could add another button here, like I said, for reject or approve or whatever the stages are. It will function the same way as all the other buttons. I can send it back to that process. But basically what I want to do is, when I'm in this in progress status, you can see my buttons on here. I can update, I can send for approval, I have special approval and reset. So instead of having the user decide what shows, I'm going to create a rule here. And again, it works the exact same way as the other pieces. So I'm actually going to show that, and I'm going to hide the other item, send for approval, when the expense total is greater than $2,000. So basically, I just did the exact same thing that you would do on a normal application, setting a rule to say send for approval or special approval around this. So now, for example, when I go into this form, you see the send for approval button. But if I go ahead and I add an item in here, I'll make it $3,000. It's going to, well, I'm not in that view. When you open this thing up, it's actually going to hide that button now. So if I were to save this and submit it, piece around here, then the special approval button will show up because of this rule here. So I'm going to show special approval. I'm going to hide send for approval when it's greater than $2,000. And so you can do that for multiple buttons. And then, as I said, this is how you would reroute different workflows. Instead of having the user decide what you want to do, you can actually send these things on to different stages in the workflow and different processes based on simple rules that you create within the workflow itself. So kind of the next level, if you dig down into this, is we've shown how you can show and hide elements within the application based on the stage. So, and make things read-only or hide a page or show an element or hide an element based on the flow. The other thing that you may want to do is actually then start to apply access control. And this is where the access section melds and meets with the workflow section. So if you think of who has access to do certain things in different phases, it goes beyond just being able to see it, but who can actually see it, who can edit it, who can update it, who has access to the different phases around that. And those are based on those roles and those access controls that we've talked about before. So, we've talked about the behavior and the flow, but if we talk about the access rights, we'll need to go into the actual access section and start to assign permissions to that. So when you go in there, and I'll show you this in just a moment, into the access stage, you'll see, you can define the roles, and kind of walks you through this is what are the roles that are going to be involved in this. You're going to have an initiator, you're going to have a reviewer, a manager, a special approver, whatever those users are that take part in your workflow will need to be defined. And then once you define those roles, then you create and you assign either users or groups or types of users, meaning you have to be a authenticated user, or you have to be a member of this LDAP group, or you have to be a specific person within the repository. And so once you assign users to those, you then assign actions to those access rights to those different stages around that. And so we have, with most forms that just have a simple submit, you're going to have just the administrator, initiator, and record owner. But we may want to go in and add a manager role, or we want to put in a senior manager for that special approval or something like that, where we can then assign people to those and then assign access to each of those phases along the way. It's a simple matter of, like we said, is it all authenticated users? Is it the person that created the instance? Is it a predefined group within the directory? Or here you can say is an individual user within a group that has access to this within this role, and then subsequently access to the actual form. And so once you've kind of defined the roles, you've assigned people or groups to those roles, then you can go into the stage settings. And so as we talked about here, we've got the different stages. So just like we have in ours, the start, in progress, approval, special approval, and end. For each one of those, you can then go in and assign who has the ability to create, read, update, all the CRUD operations to do within that different phase. So for instance, in start, it's just going to be the initiator. When it's in progress, it would be the record owner. Once it's in the approval, then maybe the initiator or record owner can read it, but they can't update it, and the manager can then update it. And then if it's in special approval, the manager can read it, but only the senior manager can update it. And so you apply the operations to each of those stages based on the roles and the access around it. And so we can set those permissions. So let's take a look at what that means here. So you're going to find that underneath the access section here. So we've got the 4 roles here, and let me create a new role around that. So now I've got 5 roles. Within these, I'm the administrator. That means I own the application. The initiator means anybody who's authenticated. Obviously, the record owner is the one that created it. The manager, I could, if I had a group in here, I could assign it, or I can, select a specific person to assign that. And, for lack of creativity, I'll assign myself as a senior manager too. So what I've done here is I've defined the roles that are going to be actors in my workflow. I've then assigned groups or people to those to create the members that make those up. And now you can see here in the stage settings. So obviously in the start, the initiator can create it, or maybe a manager can. Once it's in progress, I want the record owner to be able to update it. Manager and senior manager to be able to see it, but they can't update it. Once it's in review, I want the manager to be able to update it. The record owner can't update it, but they can see it. And then the special approval, I'll have the senior manager be able to update it, and then the manager be able to see it, and the record owner be able to see it. So very simple ways to create access controls to this. So if the record owner opens up this record while it's in special approval, they'll be able to see it, but they won't be able to edit or update the record. Only the senior manager has access to that. And that, combined with showing and hiding these different elements, goes into the effect of being able to control what people see, what people have access to, as well as, when you combine it with the access controls, as to tying it into a security role or person that you've assigned to these different roles, whether those be groups, individual users, or predefined groups, obviously, as defined by Volt within that section. So if we were to take a look at what this looks like, I deploy this out. And of course, it's all assigned to me, so I'll see all the phases in here. But basically, this is where I'd start off, and he's got it set here where it's pulling user information from a particular area. I'm going to input my airfare information. And in this case, I'm just going to save it. And you can see here, I've got it set to just show a message. Now, if I wanted that to be a little bit different, I could go in and I could change it, as I mentioned before, in the advanced settings to display a new form, or maybe I just want to show the next stage in the form. So I'm going to go through that and create that component in there. Now, since that was submitted and it's sitting in that review stage, you can see it here. So if I open this thing up, you can see now special approval is showing because it's above $3,000. The manager comments are grayed out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it for approval. It tells me it's been submitted. And now you can see here that now that I'm in that special approval stage, I can edit my comments. Whatever those comments may be, and then I can send it back. So again, now the end user sees the comments from the manager, but they're read only. I can go in and I can edit this and say, it's $1,000, and update it, or maybe I send it for approval. And you can see here where, again, now that's in the normal approval stage, everything's read only, but I do have comments, and I can come in here and I can put a comment on that and approve that stage. So now that it's at the end stage, or it's actually circulating back into that approved stage, then no more actions are taken. It's kind of done with. So you can't do anything with that stage. So that's kind of everything in a nutshell around that. So basically, think of stages as boxes in your workflow at a very high level. You can have multiple actions that happen from different stages based on rules within your form. So like you saw here, if it's above $2,000 and it needs special approval and it goes through a different route, you can send notifications. So you can send it via an email, or you can call a service. So you can call a service to update a backend service and our system, and then also send an email if you want to. And then obviously you can control roles, assign users, and set up access rights to the solution based on um, roles defined in the directory, or you can show and hide attributes based on the different stages by locking them or making them visible to the end user. So it makes it very easy to control access to each of these and create your forms.